It started like any other cold November morning in Maple Hill, Kansas, a small town where people left their doors unlocked and knew every name on their street. But that morning something was wrong. Martha Ellison's pickup truck sat in the middle of her wheat field, engine running, radio still on, and a cup of coffee steaming on the dashboard. Her coat was gone. Her phone was gone. And so was she. When deputies arrived, there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, just tire tracks fading into the dirt, and silence. Rick Donovan, her neighbor and longtime friend, said he found the truck while checking his property lines. People believed him. They always did. But as the hours turned to days, and days to weeks, Maple Hill learned how quickly certainty can turn to fear. The woman everyone knew had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions. And one neighbor who seemed a little too close to the story. If you want to know how a quiet Kansas town hid a secret for 26 years, stay with this story. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us what you think happened to Martha Ellison before Part 2 begins. Maple Hill, Kansas, November 21st, 1994. Population just under 800. The kind of quiet farming town where people waved from their trucks, where news still traveled by word of mouth, and where life moved slow enough that everyone noticed when something, anything, felt off. By sunrise that Monday, the sky was pale and still, a layer of frost clinging to the wheat. Around 7:20 a.m., a passing farmer noticed a red Ford F-150 parked out in the middle of a field, engine running, driver's door half open, exhaust drifting lazily into the cold air. He didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone stopped to check a fence line. But an hour later, when the same truck was still there, motor humming, that's when he called it in. The truck belonged to Martha Ellison, 52 years old, a widow, and a lifelong resident of Maple Hill. Everyone knew Martha. She ran her 200-acre farm alone after her husband's fatal tractor accident 5 years earlier. People described the call had come from her next-door neighbor, Rick Donovan, 58, who told dispatchers he'd just happened to drive by on his way to town. He sounded calm, too calm, one deputy later noted. But in a place like Maple Hill, Rick was trusted. He'd been part of the community for decades, always helping with harvests, fixing fences, lending tools. Nobody had reason to think twice. By 9:30 a.m., deputies had roped off the area, logging the first evidence. Coffee cup, temperature still warm to the touch. Scarf, folded, no stains or tears. Tire marks leading east toward the creek. Keys in ignition, radio on low. Each item bagged, labeled, and logged. The ground around the truck was firm, frozen from the night chill. There were no footprints leading away, no drag marks, and no indication that Martha had fallen or been pulled. The truck's tires formed a single diagonal line through the field, as if it had coasted to a stop without braking. Deputies followed the tracks a few hundred feet until they faded near Dry Willow Creek, a shallow, twisting stream that bordered her property. Nothing there, no torn fabric, no shoe prints, no sign she crossed. At that point, the scene didn't look like foul play. It looked like confusion. A missing woman, no sign of distress, no sign of robbery. But the longer her truck sat there, the less sense it made. Back in town, news spread quickly. The local diner went quiet. Calls came in from church friends and other farmers asking what happened. "She never leaves her truck running," one woman told the sheriff. "Not Martha." By noon, small groups had gathered near the road, whispering about what might have gone wrong. Then came a small but telling detail. The previous night. Around 7:30 p.m. Sunday, Martha's close friend Helen Dwyer had stopped by her house to return a casserole dish. Helen later told deputies that Martha seemed uneasy, checking the window every few minutes, tapping her fingers on the kitchen table. When Helen asked if she was okay, Martha said she'd been dealing with a problem about the property lines again, and that Rick's been acting strange about the new survey. Helen thought she was just tired, but as she left around 8:15, she noticed Martha locking her front door, something she rarely did. That conversation would become the last confirmed sighting of Martha alive. On Monday afternoon, after securing the truck, investigators visited her farmhouse. The front door was locked from the inside. Breakfast dishes sat on the counter, 2 slices of toast, half a cup of coffee. Her phone charger was plugged in, bed neatly made, jacket missing from the rack. Deputies noted the thermostat set to 67 degrees and the TV remote on the couch pointed at a dark screen. Neighbors told deputies they'd heard an engine sometime between 2 and 2:30 a.m., but assumed it was a farm vehicle. One described seeing headlights flash briefly in the wheat field before cutting out. Another mentioned hearing a dog bark repeatedly, then silence. By evening, it was clear something wasn't right. Martha wasn't the type to leave equipment running, let alone her truck. Still, no one wanted to use the word crime. In Maple Hill, that word didn't fit. The sheriff's department held a briefing that night. The working theory: Martha left her home early, possibly to meet someone, and something happened between 6 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. The distance between her farmhouse and the truck's location was just under half a mile, close enough to walk, too far to disappear unnoticed. They marked out a rough timeline. Sunday, 7:30 p.m. Last seen by friend at home, appeared anxious. Monday, 6 a.m. Normal morning routine expected. Lights on, coffee made. 7:20 a.m. Truck first noticed in field. 8:47 a.m. Vehicle officially reported. 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Scene processed, evidence logged. 12:30 p.m. First community alert issued. By sundown, the truck had been towed, and the field fell quiet again. Only the faint tire ruts and a few numbered flags remained. The sheriff's notes from that day ended with a single line: "No sign of victim." Circumstances inconsistent with voluntary departure. That night, townspeople left porch lights on. Some believed she'd simply walked off in confusion. Others whispered she'd been taken. The truth was, nobody knew. What they did know was this: the coffee on Martha's dashboard was still hot when the first deputy arrived. That means whatever happened to her, it happened fast. In a town where every routine was predictable, this one broke the pattern. A truck left running, a cup of coffee steaming, and a woman who, by all accounts, should have been home making breakfast, gone without a trace. If Martha stepped away from that truck for just a few minutes, where did she go? And who might have been waiting for her out there, in the quiet Kansas cold? By the next morning, November 22nd, 1994, Maple Hill was fully awake to the fact that something was terribly wrong. When Martha Ellison didn't come home overnight, the Waubonsee County Sheriff's Office issued an official missing person alert. What started as a quiet concern spread across town like wildfire. By 8 a.m., patrol cars rolled down County Road 7, lights flashing through the frost. 2 deputies, barely enough to cover the whole district, set up a temporary command post on the edge of Martha's property. They called in help from Topeka, and soon the farmland around Maple Hill turned into the center of one of the largest search efforts the county had ever seen. Farmers parked their tractors and joined the search. Retired neighbors showed up with binoculars. High school students brought hot coffee and blankets for the volunteers. This was the kind of town that took care of its own, and everyone believed they'd find her by nightfall. Over the next few hours, nearly 60 volunteers spread out across 12 square miles of farmland. Some rode on horseback. Others drove ATVs through the muddy fields. A small Cessna aircraft circled overhead, scanning the open wheat fields for any sign of movement. At 9:45, a canine unit from Topeka arrived. The dogs began tracking from the exact spot where Martha's truck had been found the day before. The scent was faint but clear, leading northeast across the fields, down toward Dry Willow Creek. It was slow work. The ground was uneven, frozen in some places, soft in others. The volunteers fanned out shoulder to shoulder, marking every depression and path in the soil. One deputy wrote in his notes that the scene was eerily quiet, no birds, no wind, just footsteps. By noon, the canines paused near the creek. The scent trail simply ended. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle. Just a few faint impressions in the mud, too blurred to identify. The water was shallow, barely ankle deep and flowing slow. It wasn't enough to hide a body. A soaked leather glove was found wedged between two rocks on the bank. It was small, but not Martha's size. The leather was worn, cracked, and appeared men's. Deputies collected it as evidence, unsure if it meant anything at all. The initial report noted no blood, no visible fibers, possible unrelated item. For the next 48 hours, the search continued. The temperature dropped below freezing each night. Volunteers combed the fields with flashlights, shouting Martha's name into the darkness. Helicopters scanned the area using heat detection cameras, but there were no signs of life, no unusual heat signatures. It was as if she'd been lifted out of the world. At the town's Baptist church, locals turned the fellowship hall into a staging area. Women from the congregation made sandwiches and coffee for the search teams. Someone pinned a large county map to the wall, marking search zones with red thread and thumbtacks. On the third day, Martha's son, Daniel, arrived from Wichita. He had driven through the night after hearing the news. Witnesses remembered him walking directly into the field where the truck had been found, standing still for nearly a minute, then saying quietly, "She would have called me." From that moment, he joined the Southern Search Line, helping coordinate the volunteers. The local newspaper, the Waubonsee Chronicle, printed its Wednesday edition with a front-page headline, "Farm Mystery Deepens. No sign of missing widow." Underneath was a quote from Sheriff Vance, "Every resource available is being used. We have not given up." Still, every passing hour made the story harder to believe. Then, a small lead. A milk delivery driver told deputies he'd seen headlights around 3 a.m. Monday morning, parked near the edge of County Road 7. Less than a mile from Martha's home. "It looked like a pickup," he said. "Maybe red or maroon. I figured it was one of the farmers out early." That sighting lined up almost perfectly with where Martha's truck was later discovered. Investigators tried to verify it, but there were no other witnesses, no cameras in the area. In 1994, Maple Hill didn't have streetlights outside the main road, and security cameras were rare even in gas stations. As the second week dragged on, hope began to fade. Planes continued their grid sweeps, canines rotated out, and deputies rechecked every ditch, well, and drainage pipe within 5 miles. The final report from the third search day read, "No clothing recovered, no prints identifiable, no radio or phone activity." The search turned into routine repetition. Same ground, same silence. A volunteer later said, "It felt like chasing smoke. You keep reaching for something that's already gone." By November 24th, the sheriff's office officially reclassified the case from missing to suspicious circumstances. It didn't mean they believed there'd been foul play, but they couldn't rule it out either. Sheriff Vance gathered his team and went over what little they had: an abandoned truck, a missing woman, and no evidence of departure. He told reporters, "We're keeping all options open, but we're treating this as more than a disappearance." The next day, investigators began interviewing Martha's close circle: neighbors, friends, and employees from the nearby co-op. Everyone described her as consistent, predictable, and careful. But one deputy made a note about Rick Donovan, the man who found her truck. Rick was at every search, every volunteer meeting, offering help, staying late. His knowledge of the area was unmatched. He owned the adjacent property, and he knew every trail and creek crossing by memory. Still, something about his behavior unsettled a few people. A volunteer named Kevin. For those who had spent weeks walking those fields, the end felt hollow. They had searched every mile, checked every creek bed, every ditch, every abandoned shed. There was nothing left to find. One deputy summed it up best in his final note: "We searched 12 square miles, combed every path, but found nothing." In a town this small, how can someone disappear so completely? The fields of Maple Hill fell silent again. The snow buried the tire tracks, the footprints, and the last visible signs of effort. The red flags marking search zones fluttered faintly in the wind. And for the first time in its history, Maple Hill, this quiet Kansas town that prided itself on knowing everything about everyone, had to live with a mystery that refused to be solved. The search had ended, but the questions had just begun. Martha Ellison wasn't just another missing name on a police report. In Maple Hill, everyone knew her, or at least thought they did. She was born and raised right there in town, the daughter of wheat farmers who built their lives around long summers, hard winters, and the steady rhythm of the harvest. At 52, she was a widow, independent, and still managing over 200 acres of farmland on her own. Her husband had died in a tractor accident 5 years earlier, and ever since she'd run the place herself, every acre, every season, without missing a beat. She wasn't the kind of woman who relied on luck. Martha believed in order, in getting up before sunrise, in keeping receipts in neat columns, in writing everything down by hand. Her morning routine hadn't changed in years: coffee by 5:30, a walk to the barn by 6:15, checking the fence lines and the feed. Mondays and Thursdays were co-op days. Sunday mornings were for church, and Sunday evenings were for her weekly call with her son Daniel, who lived 2 hours away in Wichita. People described her as steady, practical, and private. The kind of woman who'd lend you a wrench but never gossip about you at church. One co-op worker said later, Martha never missed a Monday. If she didn't show up, something was wrong. That Sunday night, November 20th, Martha's friend Helen Dwyer dropped by with a pie. She was the last known person to see her alive. Helen said later, she kept checking the window. She said it was about the property lines again. When Helen left around 9, she remembered Martha locking her front door, something she almost never did. In 1994, Maple Hill didn't have streetlights beyond Main Street, and very few homes had security systems. Martha didn't use one. Her world was still a place where people trusted locks less than they trusted each other. Inside her house, everything was in order. The dishes were clean. Her winter coat hung by the door. Her purse, jewelry, and checkbook were untouched. There were no signs she had packed or planned to leave. Her bedroom lamp was still on. Investigators later found her handwritten ledger open on the kitchen table. The last line read, Monday, 6:45. Check north fence / call H. It was written in her usual, neat blue ink. She never made that call. Financial records showed no sudden withdrawals or debts. If anything, she was on the verge of something promising. A small energy company from Wichita had approached her with a land lease for natural gas exploration. It wasn't a massive deal, but for someone like Martha, it meant security. A little more freedom, a cushion for the years ahead. The contract was still in draft form when she vanished. That lease, investigators later noted, would have increased the value of her land substantially, especially if she owned full mineral rights. And that, in rural Kansas, was enough to stir quiet tensions between neighbors. Her relationship with Rick Donovan had always been complicated. Rick, 58, lived half a mile east, a widower himself. To most people, he was helpful. Always first to lend a hand during harvest season, quick with a tool or a truck. He'd helped Martha with fence repairs, fixed her gate, and even driven her to town a few times when her truck broke down. But some locals said he had started showing up too often. In small towns, generosity and obsession can look the same, until they don't. Property records showed the Donovan and Ellison farms had shared a fence line since the 1970s. There were no legal disputes on record, but Rick had made informal complaints over the years, mostly about Martha's tractors tearing up his grass. The county dismissed them as neighborly misunderstandings. That fall, the two were seen arguing near the edge of the north field, exactly where survey stakes later appeared. Helen recalled Martha being tired of the nonsense. She said, "I told her just get it surveyed and be done with it." Martha nodded, but Helen remembered one more thing. She looked over my shoulder like she expected someone to be there. At the time, no one thought much of it. But when you look at the sequence of events, the land dispute, the gas lease, the argument, the locked door, it starts to form a picture that's hard to ignore. The sheriff's notes from 1994 included one small line. Victim known to have tension with neighbor over land rights. Ongoing dispute. It wasn't treated as a lead then, just a background detail in a missing persons file. But in hindsight, it meant everything. By every account, Martha was not the type to leave town, not even overnight. Her medical history showed only minor back pain, no medications, no signs of depression, no talk of wanting to start over somewhere else. Every anchor of her life, her church, her son, her land, was rooted in that farm. Her home phone log from the week before she vanished showed 4 calls, one to the co-op, one to Helen, one to the surveyor, and one short call to Rick's number, recorded on Thursday evening. No message, no callback. Her personal network was small but steady. Church on Sundays, grocery runs on Tuesdays, coffee with Helen every other Friday. In Maple Hill, that's all you needed to build a life. Routine, land, and trust. But that routine, the very thing that defined her, also made her disappearance impossible to explain. Everything about her life followed a pattern. And then one day, It just stopped. In small towns like Maple Hill, people talk about how kindness keeps them close. But when someone goes missing, that closeness turns into scrutiny. Who knew her best? Who saw her last? Who had something to gain? Rick Donovan was always around. During harvests, during storms, during every community gathering. After she vanished, he led search groups, gave interviews, and stood next to Daniel at every vigil. He seemed loyal, maybe too loyal. As one neighbor later put it, Rick was the kind of man who knew every gate, every fence, every field. And maybe that was the problem. By the end of that year, investigators had built an unspoken profile. A woman with valuable land, a financial opportunity, a history of boundary disputes, and a neighbor who never seemed far away. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even suspicion yet. But it was a pattern. And as the case file closed for the winter of 1994, one note stood out among all the paperwork. He was always around. At 10:47 p.m., a call hit the switchboard from a payphone at Cedar Ridge Fuel, a small gas station 7 miles from Martha's home. The line registered as a coin call. The machine's stamped ID matched the booth beside the store entrance. There was no camera. The card reader inside the shop kept only paper totals for cash transactions. It was 1994. No cell pings, no security footage, no convenience of GPS trails. Just a payphone, a receiver, and a voice. Operators later flagged one sentence from the audio. "You can't keep doing this, Rick." The voice was Martha's, tight and controlled, layered over the hiss of highway air and the steady rattle of a refrigeration unit outside the station. The conversation ran just under 12 minutes. Then, during the last 10 seconds, there was a metallic clink, a dull thud, wind blooming across the receiver, and silence. To make sense of that call, investigators built a minute-by-minute clock. At roughly 10:32 p.m., a network saw the glow of headlights leaving the Ellison driveway and turning east. 12 to 14 minutes later, a driver could reach Cedar Ridge Fuel, exactly the timestamp of the payphone connection. At 10:59 p.m., 2 different residents living along County Road 7 reported hearing an engine rev briefly and cut off. The timeline doesn't solve the case, but it fixes anchor points that don't move. A late-shift clerk at the gas station remembered a woman near the booth. Middle-aged, bundled in a dark coat, a knit cap pulled low. She stood with one hand shielding the mouthpiece, eyes scanning the road as if waiting for headlights to crest the hill. The clerk said she kept looking at the road like she was waiting on someone. After the call, a customer receipt book logged a cash sale around 10:50 to 10:55 p.m. 1 bottle of water and a roll of mint candy. No name, no signature, just the exact price posted on the wall. It fits without proving anything. In a case like this, fit matters. Technically, the payphone gave investigators very little. Analog switching meant they could confirm the call's origin and the destination number. The booth itself offered small, stubborn facts. The metal casing bore fingerprints from hundreds of customers. Nothing clean enough to isolate. The concrete pad showed a smear of dried mud with a sandy texture consistent with farm roads after a cold evening. That same texture existed everywhere in Maple Hill. The booth's coin return had 3 quarters and a penny. The receiver's cord was intact. No sign of a struggle at the payphone, no scuff marks that suggested a fall. The phone did what phones do. It connected a voice to a number and kept the rest to itself. Back at the house, the inside clock of Martha's life lined up with that call. Her ledger note, Monday 6:45, check north fence /call H, sat open on the kitchen table. H likely meant Helen, her friend, or Henry, the surveyor. She had planned to call one of them the next morning, not at almost 11 on a Sunday night. Whatever pushed her out the door was not routine. She was a person who kept routines because they made sense. Leaving home late, driving to a payphone, and naming her neighbor out loud does not read as routine. A long-haul trucker passing through around 11 told deputies he heard a sharp metallic bang by the pumps, like a heavy door catching in the wind. He kept driving. The station clerk later said wind sometimes rattled the price board, but on that night, the sound felt heavier. This is the nature of these cases, sounds without sources, details that feel important but won't sit still for long. The road between the farm and Cedar Ridge is simple. Out the drive, a right turn, 2 long miles, a gentle curve, then the station's neon sign. If Martha drove straight there, she made the trip in about 12 minutes. If she met someone, there's no record of a second vehicle at the booth. If she expected someone to arrive, no one stepped forward to say they had. This is where the narrative goes quiet and the clock grows loud. The sentence, "You can't keep doing this, Rick," carries weight because it signals pattern. Keep doing this implies repetition, a behavior she had already warned him about or complained of to others. The phrasing also reads like a boundary. Stop whatever has been happening. On its own, by midnight, the highway was empty again. The booth stood under its buzzing light, the receiver back on the hook. The bottle of water and mints were gone with whoever bought them. The clerk locked the station at 11 and left the night to the frost. Out on County Road 7, engines were quiet. No one reported seeing a car on the shoulder. No one called in a broken-down pickup. Whatever happened after that call, it didn't leave marks that could be photographed the next morning. When investigators reconstructed the route, they could only say this. Martha left her house late, drove 7 miles to a payphone, spoke for 12 minutes, said Rick's name in a way that pointed to a problem, and ended the call with a sound that doesn't have a clean label. Minutes later, multiple residents heard an engine flare and die somewhere along the same road. By dawn, her truck would be found running in a field, and she would be gone. The distance between a sentence and a disappearance is a narrow one in a town without cameras. But the call fixed 2 truths. It stamped a place on the map, and it put a name on the record. In an investigation with more questions than evidence, those 2 anchors are what remain when memory blunts and stories shift. So the focus lands where it must. Who was Martha calling out at 10:47 p.m.? Why did she choose a payphone and not her home line? If she was waiting on someone at the station, did they arrive on time, or somewhere else along the road? And if a pattern had formed before that night, where else does it show up? In phone logs, in neighbor complaints, in a ledger note, in an argument nobody wrote down. As we move forward, we'll follow how this single phone call reshaped the way people in Maple Hill understood the case. How a late-night drive, a payphone, and a 12-minute conversation turned a quiet disappearance into a community's most persistent question. If you're invested in getting answers, stay with this investigation. Like the video, share your thoughts about who Martha was waiting for at that booth, and subscribe so you don't miss the following chapter of this case. Your life in Maple Hill moved on. Seasons passed, crops were planted, children grew up, and new families took over old farms. Daniel Ellison, Martha's only son, left town for Wichita and tried to build a life of his own. But he never disconnected his mother's old phone line. He couldn't. He paid the bill every month, saying it felt wrong to silence the number that once tied them together. Every November 21st, he drove back to Maple Hill, parked by the same field where her truck had been found, and placed a bouquet of fresh flowers in the soil. In winter, when snow swept across the plains, he'd stand there alone, staring at the horizon that had swallowed her. Meanwhile, Rick Donovan stayed right where he'd always been. He kept the same house, the same farm, the same friendly reputation. In Maple Hill, he was known as a helper, someone who showed up for neighbors, repaired fences, and donated to church raffles. Each year, when the community held a small remembrance service for Martha, Rick stood near the front, eyes wet, voice shaking just enough to sound sincere. "If only I'd stopped by earlier," he told the Maple Hill Gazette in 1998. The town believed him, maybe because they wanted to. In small towns, faith in one another is part of survival. By the early 2000s, the story of Martha Ellison had turned into a kind of local folklore. Teenagers whispered it at bonfires. The woman who vanished into her own field, leaving a truck that wouldn't stop running. The search markers that once dotted the land had long been torn down or swallowed by the earth. Where deputies once marched, shoulder to shoulder, wheat now grew thick and golden. The volunteers who combed the fields had retired, moved away, or passed on. Her name still existed somewhere in a filing cabinet, but to most, it was just an old ghost story from a quieter time. For Daniel, though, silence never meant acceptance. He carried his mother's photo everywhere, a worn picture of her standing in front of the barn, sleeves rolled up, eyes squinting against the sun. He wrote to the sheriff's office dozens. Rick Donovan remained part of every community photo. He joined the volunteer fire crew, helped build the new playground, and planted flowers outside the Baptist church. At every anniversary vigil for Martha, he spoke briefly, his voice trembling just enough to sound heartfelt. "She was like family," he said once. "We all lost something that day." The crowd nodded, some even wiping away tears. The same man who had found her truck became the one who led the prayers. No one questioned it. In Maple Hill, suspicion was reserved for strangers, not for the people who lived next door. Years blurred together. Daniel grew older, raised 2 children of his own, and taught his son to drive using his mother's restored pickup, the same F-150 that had been pulled from the field. He kept it in perfect condition, as if keeping it running could keep part of her alive. Technology moved forward, but the official record didn't. On paper, Martha Ellison remained exactly what she had been since 1994. Missing person number 94-1182. A number in a basement file. Even so, Daniel never gave up. In 2016, after seeing a television special about cold cases being solved through new forensic methods, he sent another request. This time not to the county, but directly to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. The message was short. "My mother disappeared in 1994. Her name was Martha Ellison. Please don't let her stay lost." Months passed with no reply. 2 years later, in 2018, he finally received one. A young investigator from the Bureau had agreed to review the file as part of the state cold case initiative. Her name was Amanda Rodriguez. Amanda's first words to him, according to Daniel, were simple. "Old cases never die. They just wait for someone to open the box again." She asked for copies of the original maps, photographs, and any personal notes the family had kept. Daniel drove them down himself, along with the old newspaper clippings and his mother's favorite red scarf. After 26 years of silence, Martha Ellison case was no longer forgotten. It was open again, even if just a crack. During those quiet years, Maple Hill had changed on the surface, but not underneath. The gas station where Martha made her last call was still there, now with newer pumps and bright LED signs. Rick's farm stood the same distance from hers, the fence line still dividing their properties. And the people, some new, some old, still spoke her name in low tones, careful not to reopen old wounds. Yet for Daniel, that wound had never closed. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every drive through the county was another reminder of the space she once filled. The silence surrounding the case wasn't just about absence. It was about comfort. The town had learned to live with not knowing. Rick had learned how to play the part of the grieving neighbor. And the police had learned that resources ran out long before answers arrived. For 26 years, the truth had been buried under habit and politeness. The kind of silence that doesn't shout, it settles. But then came the email. One new name on an old file. A young detective in Topeka who still believed in evidence over rumors. For Daniel, it was the first real movement in decades, a chance to lift his mother's story out of the dust and back into daylight. The next steps would reopen everything Maple Hill thought it had already buried. But for now, the moment belonged to Daniel. The son who never stopped asking. The man who refused to let a cold case freeze his mother's memory. Because in Kansas, where time moves slow and secrets can sit in soil for generations, it only takes one person to break the silence. And 26 years after Martha Ellison vanished, that person had finally arrived. By 2018, the Ellison case had become little more than a number in the state archive, one of thousands marked unsolved. But in Topeka, a young investigator named Amanda Rodriguez decided to open the box no one had touched in years. She was 36, methodical, and trained in cold case reconstruction. Her first step was simple: rebuild everything from zero. No assumptions, no inherited theories. She called Daniel Ellison the same week she got the file. The conversation was quiet, respectful. He'd been waiting for that call for more than 2 decades. She told him she planned to digitize every record from phone logs to search maps. Within days, Amanda and her small team began scanning yellowed reports, photographs, and 9/11 transcripts. They built an interactive timeline layering time, weather, and geography. For the first time, the case wasn't a stack of paper. It was data that could finally be seen as a whole. Amanda's next move was biological. She asked Daniel for a buccal DNA swab, a reference sample in case any human remains were ever recovered. He agreed immediately. Then she began what she called the nucleus interviews, a focused re-examination of the few people whose stories had shaped the original investigation. Helen Dwyer, a neighbor who once claimed to see headlights on County Road 7. The night shift attendant at the Cedar Ridge gas station. And a long-haul driver who had reported hearing a heavy metallic thud somewhere near midnight. Each of them remembered fragments, all familiar, but Amanda logged every word again under 2018 protocols. The tone of her notes was clinical. No conclusions, pattern building only. When she cross-checked those accounts with aerial data, one thing stood out. Satellite images showed subtle changes on a parcel of land bordering Rick Donovan's old barn. The area had been leveled sometime in the late 1990s, the soil tone different from the rest of the property. Back in 1994, that ground had been rough pasture. Now it was smooth, almost too even. Amanda marked it on her list of priority grids, locations with potential for concealment, isolated access, and proximity to where Martha's truck was found. In early spring, she deployed drone mapping over the Donovan property, creating a detailed orthomosaic of the terrain. It confirmed a rectangular patch roughly 40 feet wide, showing signs of disturbance under the topsoil. To verify it, she brought in the ground-penetrating radar unit, running a tight scan every half meter. The readings revealed 3 subsurface anomalies, 2 shallow, 1 deep, consistent with human-sized voids. The patterns formed classic hyperbolic reflections, the signature of something solid buried where the earth should have been uniform. Amanda didn't rush. She brought in a human remains detection canine trained with scent samples derived from Martha's old hairbrush, preserved by Daniel all these years. When the dog circled the flattened section near the old livestock shed, it paused, then sat. Not a full alert, just a hesitation. Enough to justify paperwork. Within 48 hours, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation filed a search warrant for excavation. The document cited scientific anomalies detected via GPR, corroborated by canine behavior. The warrant covered a confined zone, roughly 20 square meters, and required strict chain of custody for every sample removed. The dig began on a cloudy morning that April. Investigators erected a perimeter tent to shield the site and logged every entry on camera. No heavy equipment was allowed on the top layer. They worked with trowels and brushes, lifting soil in measured squares, each sample bagged and labeled with depth, position, and texture. The smell of damp earth mixed with diesel from the portable lights. The air was tense but quiet. About 3 hours in, at just under 3 feet, one of the technicians noticed a pale curve breaking through the clay, a fragment of bone. Slowly, layer by layer, a partial hand began to take shape, the wrist bound by what looked like decayed nylon cord. The material had fused to the bone, brittle but recognizable. Minutes later, they uncovered a small section of skull showing a fracture line across the right temporal side, evidence of blunt force impact. Nearby, they recovered a metal shirt button, a comb with the remains were transferred under escort to the state medical examiner's facility in Topeka. Forensic anthropologists began reconstructing the skeleton, estimating sex, age, and stature. Preliminary analysis confirmed. Female, mid-50s, 5 feet 5 inches, consistent with Martha Ellison. Samples were taken from teeth and femur for DNA extraction. The nylon cord was analyzed separately for epithelial transfer, any residual skin cells that might belong to someone else. Amanda personally called Daniel the next day. She spoke carefully, that they had found remains likely to be his mother, pending lab confirmation. Daniel agreed to provide his mother's dental records and any photographs of her jewelry for comparison. When she hung up, she filed a single line in her report. Notification complete. Next of kin cooperative. The sheriff's office issued a brief statement to local media. Remains believed to be connected to the 1994 disappearance of Martha Ellison have been recovered in Maple Hill. The investigation is now classified as a homicide. No mention of the location, no speculation, just facts. Behind the scenes, Amanda set up a community briefing with the Maple Hill Church Board. She explained that the site was under forensic review and urged residents not to spread rumors. At the same time, a hotline was launched for anyone with information from 1994, particularly about vehicles, equipment, or unusual night activity near County Road 7. Old memories sometimes surface when people realize the past isn't gone after all. Within days, the small town buzzed again, quietly, cautiously. Some remembered that Rick had flattened that section of land the year after Martha vanished. Others dismissed it as coincidence. But for investigators, coincidence was no longer an acceptable explanation. The evidence would speak next. The bones, the soil, the rope. After 26 years, silence had finally given up its ground. And with it came the question no one in Maple Hill was ready to face. Who buried Martha Ellison beneath her neighbor's field? By the time the evidence next came the items that might hold someone else's trace. The nylon cord was handled as touch evidence, the kind of surface that can carry microscopic skin cells when hands tie knots and pull tight. Scrapes from beneath the fingernails were processed in parallel. The lab notes were dry by design. Careful extraction, quantification, profiling at the standard genetic markers used across the country. Controls passed. Readings were stable. Duplicate runs confirmed the same peak patterns. The science didn't lean on a hunch. It repeated itself until the facts were solid. When the lab issued its second report, the tone of the investigation changed again. DNA recovered from the nylon and from beneath Martha's fingernails produced a profile consistent with a living male. When compared to the court-ordered reference sample collected from Rick Donovan, the result was described as indistinguishable across tested loci, with a statistical likelihood astronomically unlikely to be anyone else. In plainer language, the probability of a random match was effectively zero. The signature of the person who had handled the ligature and the person whose skin cells were trapped under the victim's nails matched the neighbor who had first reported the truck. With that, probable cause cleared the bar. Investigators secured a search warrant for the Donovan property to look for corroborating evidence, receipts, tools, anything that could link the objects in the grave to objects in his life. They logged a purchase slip for nylon cord of the same width, sold at a feed store 2 towns over. In a back shed, they seized a stained wooden mallet, bagged without comment for later testing. They photographed an old hand-drawn sketch of a property line, the margins penciled with notes about fence posts and a tractor path. None of these items alone tell a whole story. Together they add weight to a story the DNA had already begun to tell. From there, the team rebuilt the clock. A late-night call from a payphone at 10:47 p.m. naming Rick. Residents along County Road 7 reporting an engine flare and die around 10:59 p.m. A truck found later in a field less than a mile from his property. A burial site within walking distance. When the time came to confront him, the interview room was standardized. Camera on, audio clean, counsel present. At first, Rick repeated what he'd said in 1994. He was asleep. He didn't hear the phone. He had no idea where Martha went. Then, he was shown the lab result. Not speculation, not rumor, numbers and names in black and white. His posture shifted. His words did too. She fought me. I didn't mean to. The sentence landed without theatrics, and the tape kept rolling. He said they argued about the property line, the tractor path, paperwork she threatened to take to the sheriff. He said he lost his temper and struck her. He said he tied her wrists and moved her truck to make it look like she'd just stepped away. Every phrase was recorded as an allegation, not a final truth, because that's what it was until a court weighed it. On the physical side, the picture lined up. The fracture on the right side of the skull was consistent with blunt force. The ligature around the wrist explained why she couldn't have walked away. Items found near the grave, comb, button, fabric, matched the era and the person. Science provided the hard edges. The rest was careful assembly. A case isn't a story until every piece can be tested and withstood. Maple Hill heard the news the way small towns always do, first in whispers, then all at once. The neighbor who had prayed at the front of the church, who had watered the flowers by the steps, was now the name on a state lab report. Shock traveled fast. A few people said the lab must have made a mistake. Most people didn't say anything at all. Daniel kept it simple. I wanted the truth, not a story. Now we have something real. The sheriff's office booked Rick Donovan on charges that reflected the evidence: homicide, along with counts related to concealment of a body. A judge reviewed the affidavit, weighed the risk, and set the initial terms. The case status changed from open homicide to charged and pending. No convictions, no sentencing. Only the formal beginning of what would be decided in court. Through all of it, one standard remained in place and had to be said out loud. It is tempting to fill in the blanks with emotion, to say what someone must have felt or why they did what they did. That's not how a case like this should be told. What matters, and what a court will hear, is the sequence that took a missing person from a wheat field to a shallow grave and left behind enough evidence to find her and speak for her. Identity confirmed. DNA matched. A statement recorded. A charge filed. Each step sits on the one before it. There is also the quiet cost of the match. For 26 years, a town turned a disappearance into a memory it could live with. That memory is gone. It's been replaced by fingerprints on evidence tape, dates on warrants, and a lab report that will be read out loud under oath. For the family, truth is not relief so much as a change in the air. The weight is the same, but it finally has a name attached. As the file moved from lab bench to courtroom calendar, the language shifted too. Missing became victim. Neighbor became defendant. Rumor became exhibit. The work from this point would be legal, not investigative. Arguments about probability, procedure, and credibility would replace aerial maps and ground scans. But none of those arguments would exist without the hard center. DNA recovered from a rope and from beneath a woman's nails after a struggle she did not start and could not finish. In the end, the science didn't answer every question. It didn't explain why things escalated or what was said under a dark sky. It did something more important. It identified a person who was there when it happened. It placed that person's touch where it never should have been. It joined the last phone call, the paused engine, and the staged truck into a single path that led from a farm road to a grave. That is where this chapter closes, with a match that broke a silence, a charge that put a name on the record, and a town that could no longer pretend it didn't know where to look. By the spring of 2020, the state of Kansas was ready to close a case that had haunted it for more than 2 decades. The courtroom in Shawnee County was packed. The prosecutor opened without theatrics. He didn't need any. Rick Donovan didn't just kill a woman, he said. He buried her 300 feet from his own back door and lived the next 26 years as a hero among us. A map appeared before the jury. The Donovan property, the collapsed barn, the shallow grave, the place where Martha's truck had been staged. All of it within walking distance. He stood in church, the prosecutor continued, shedding tears for the woman he buried with his own hands. The defense countered quietly. Rick's attorney described a panicked moment, not a planned act. He told the jury his client was an elderly man who had lived a good life, respected in his community, and who acted in fear and confusion. It was, he said, an accident that spiraled. But the prosecution pushed back. No signs of self-defense, no evidence of an accident, and 26 years of silence. Panic doesn't dig a grave, the prosecutor said. It doesn't move a truck. It doesn't live among you for half a lifetime, pretending to be a victim too. Then came the evidence. The state's forensic analyst took the stand with the lab report that had broken the case open. DNA from the nylon ligature and from beneath Martha's fingernails matched Rick Donovan, with a probability of error described as less than 1 in a billion. The numbers spoke louder than emotion ever could. A digital image of the STR chart flickered on the courtroom screen. Clean peaks, perfect alignment, no room for doubt. Detective Amanda Rodriguez described how her cold case unit had reopened the file in 2018, how drone scans revealed a patch of soil that didn't belong, and how the ground-penetrating radar confirmed what everyone had been afraid to find. She walked the jury through the process, how canine units had picked up the scent, how excavation revealed the nylon cord, and how each step of the chain of custody stayed airtight. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, methodical, irrefutable. Then came Daniel Ellison. He spoke softly, recalling the unanswered phone call that still echoed in his head. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty on all counts, murder in the first degree, and concealment of a body. Rick Donovan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction, only adjusted his glasses again and looked at the floor. For Maple Hill, the silence that followed the verdict was its own kind of sound, heavy, final, necessary. Outside the courthouse, the press waited in the early afternoon light. Daniel Ellison stood before the microphones for the first and last time. "Mom finally gets to rest," he said. "I've spent half my life trying to find her. Now I can just remember her." It wasn't triumph. It was relief with nowhere to go. Amanda Rodriguez spoke next. "Justice can be slow," she told reporters, "but it never stops moving." Behind her, members of her cold case team, the forensic techs, the canine handler, the analysts, stood quietly. They didn't smile. They just nodded. The Topeka Capital Journal ran its headline that evening. Justice 26 years late, but not denied. Back in Maple Hill, word traveled faster than the newspaper trucks. That weekend, the town's small white church opened its doors for the first memorial service officially held in Martha Ellison's name. Candles lined the aisle, and her photograph, restored and framed, was placed at the front beside a single vase of sunflowers. Some who attended had once volunteered in the first search. Others had long stopped believing she'd be found. No one spoke of Rick Donovan. They spoke of Martha's kindness, her stubbornness, her farm. At the community center, a new bulletin board went up next to the grain co-op schedule. On it, a handwritten note read, "Thank you for not forgetting." Someone had taped a copy of the verdict below it. Neighbors who had once defended Rick avoided his old property. Kids who grew up hearing about the woman who vanished now knew the truth was buried right down the road. One local farmer brought a bouquet of sunflowers to the site, grown from the same field Martha had once harvested herself. The town didn't celebrate. It exhaled. There were no parades, no speeches about closure. Just the sound of evening wind moving across wheat again. People said they felt lighter. Not happy, but lighter. As one resident put it, it wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth, finally speaking. When the courthouse lights went out that night, Daniel drove back toward Maple Hill. The sky over the fields was clear, the kind his mother used to love before harvest season. On the roadside, a small wooden sign stood half-covered in grass. Ellison Farm, since 1942. He stopped long enough to set his mother's photograph against it, and left without saying anything. In the end, justice didn't arrive with applause or anger. It came in the quiet balance between what was taken and what was finally returned. A name restored, a town unburdened, and a truth that, after 26 years, no longer needed to hide. When the trial ended, the story of Martha Ellison didn't fade away. It became something larger, a lesson, a warning, and a quiet promise that truth, no matter how long it sleeps, can still wake up. In the months that followed the verdict, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation released a detailed report summarizing the case. It called the Ellison investigation a milestone of persistence meeting science. The report was soon added to the official training materials for the Kansas Cold Case Initiative, a statewide program for investigators specializing in unsolved disappearances. In classrooms across the state, her case became a case study, proof that a cold case isn't cold when someone keeps asking questions. On the first slide of the training presentation was a single quote: "Evidence never gets old. Only how we read it does." Students were told about the GPR scans that found disturbed soil, the DNA extracted from degraded nylon fibers, and the discipline it took to rebuild a case others had given up on. Amanda Rodriguez, the detective who reopened the file, was promoted to Special Investigations Advisor. Her focus? Forgotten files, incomplete records, and stories like Martha's that had slipped through cracks in the system. When asked about the case at a law enforcement seminar, she said, "We didn't discover something new. We just finally looked hard enough." Meanwhile, Daniel Ellison went back to Maple Hill one last time. The wheat fields were tall again, gold under the early summer light. He stood where his mother's truck had once been found and pushed a small wooden stake into the ground. On it were 5 simple words burned into the grain: "For Mom and for truth." He didn't want a memorial or a statue. He wanted something that reminded people of what silence can cost. That fall, Daniel created the Ellison Foundation, a nonprofit helping families of the missing navigate what he once went through, funding searches, covering legal paperwork, and offering training to rural communities on how to recognize danger and report it early. The foundation partnered with sheriff's offices and forensic teams across the Midwest. In its first year, it helped reopen 5 dormant cases. Daniel refused to take credit. "It's just paying forward what someone once did for me," he said. Back in Maple Hill, the town changed in small but visible ways. The local church built a simple sign at its front gate that read, "Site of Justice Found." Every November, townspeople planted sunflowers along the old fence line of the Ellison property, the same fields where the search had once ended in despair. The local high school added a yearly program called Local History of Courage and Truth, where students learned about Martha's case not as a tragedy, but as a story of endurance and accountability. A generation that once grew up with rumors now grew up with facts. They were taught that truth doesn't always live in the stories people tell. It sometimes lies, buried, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. In Topeka, Amanda Rodriguez spoke at a statewide conference on forensic innovation. "Science doesn't forget," she said. "People do. But when you put both together, you get justice." Her words spread far beyond the room. A local journalist who had covered the case from the beginning wrote afterward, "This case reminded us that betrayal often wears the face of familiarity." That line was reprinted in True Crime Review and soon became part of the national conversation around cold cases. Maple Hill was no longer called the town with a mystery. It became the town that refused to let silence win. Each year, the Ellison Foundation released an annual report documenting solved cases assisted by community involvement. On the cover, one phrase never changed: "For every Martha, there's still someone waiting." Daniel often appeared as a guest speaker on Voices of the Missing, a podcast dedicated to families of long-term disappearances. He spoke plainly, with the steady voice of someone who had already lived through the ending. He always closed with the same line: "It took half my life, but she was never forgotten." In one of his final public appearances, Daniel returned to the field where everything had begun. The sky was soft that evening, the air still. He placed a small bouquet of sunflowers at the base of the memorial stake. The camera crews stayed back. No one spoke. There was no grand ceremony, no audience, no speech. Just the quiet understanding that something once hidden had finally